The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the barren land. A soft breeze whispered through the ruins, carrying with it the scent of dust and forgotten history. It was a quiet place, the kind where one would expect nothing more than silence and solitude. Yet, for young Elias, this desolate world was anything but ordinary. He wandered among the ancient structures, his footsteps echoing off the crumbling stone, his mind racing with questions about the planet's forgotten past. Elias had come here by accident. A small, curious man with a knack for exploration, he'd been traveling across galaxies, looking for relics and stories of worlds lost to time. This place, however, was different. There was something about the atmosphere, an eerie presence, like a ghost watching him from the shadows. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, even though he could see no one. As he walked deeper into the ruins, something caught his eye. It was a glint, faint but noticeable, hidden among the rocks at the foot of a collapsed pillar. His curiosity piqued. Elias knelt down and brushed the dirt away. At first, he thought it was just another piece of broken debris. But as he cleared the dust, a rusted blade began to emerge from the earth. It was old, its surface covered in years of corrosion and neglect, but there was a strange beauty to it. The hilt was intricately carved, its design unlike anything Elias had ever seen. He felt a strange pull, a whisper in his mind telling him to pick it up. Without thinking, he grasped the sword's hilt, his fingers closing around the cold metal. A shock ran through him, as if the sword itself had awoken from a deep slumber. The ground beneath him trembled slightly, and for a moment, he felt dizzy. It wasn't a normal sensation. It was more like the earth itself was reacting to his touch. Elias staggered back, dropping the sword as he regained his balance. But something had changed. He could feel it in his bones, a connection to something ancient and powerful, something far beyond his understanding. He stared at the sword, still lying on the ground, its blade catching the fading light of the sun. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence returned, as if the world had resumed its peaceful slumber. Elias frowned, unsure of what he had just experienced. Maybe it was just his imagination, playing tricks on him. Yet deep inside, he knew it wasn't. He knew that the sword was not just a relic. It was something far more important. The visions that flashed through his mind when he first touched it told him so. There had been flashes, images of a grand city, a palace towering over the landscape, and a figure sitting on a throne, their face obscured by a crown. The figure had been surrounded by people, their eyes filled with respect and fear. And then there had been the darkness, a betrayal, and a world that had burned to the ground. The memories were fragmented, pieces of a long-forgotten story. Yet one thing was clear. This sword was a key, a piece of something larger than he could comprehend. Elias stood up, dusting off his clothes, his mind racing with questions. Who had left this sword here? Why had it been buried in such a remote place? And most importantly, why had he been the one to find it? He wasn't a hero, just an explorer looking for a story to tell. Yet the sword felt like it had chosen him, and that terrified him. The silence of the ruins pressed in on him, but it wasn't just the usual stillness of an abandoned world. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Elias picked up the sword again, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It was heavier than he expected, its ancient metal cold and unforgiving. As his fingers tightened around the hilt, the sword seemed to hum with energy, as though it had a life of its own. Suddenly, a voice broke the stillness, soft and distant. Elias turned, his heart racing. There was no one there. The voice, though faint, was unmistakable. It had come from the sword itself, or at least that's what it felt like. "You are the one," it whispered, barely audible. "The lost heir, the Emperor." Elias froze. His breath caught in his throat. The words echoed in his mind, reverberating like a drumbeat in the darkness. He was the heir, the Emperor. It didn't make sense. He was nothing more than a wanderer, a man with no title, no purpose beyond exploring forgotten worlds. But the sword spoke to him, and it felt real. His eyes darted around, but there was no one in sight. The ruins were as empty as they had been when he first arrived. Was he hearing things? Was it possible that the isolation had finally gotten to him? That he was imagining voices from the past? But something told him that wasn't the case. There was more to this sword, more to his discovery than he could possibly understand right now. He knelt down again, inspecting the blade closely. The rust and corrosion were only on the surface. Beneath, the metal seemed to shimmer faintly, almost as if it were alive, reacting to the touch of his fingers. He could feel a connection to it, a strange bond that pulled him in deeper with every passing second. It was as if the sword was calling him, urging him to learn its secrets, to awaken the power that lay dormant within. A chill ran down Elias' spine as he stood up, looking around once more. The ruins, the whispers, the sword, it all felt like a dream. But it wasn't. It was real, and it was happening to him. He was the one who had found this sword, and now he had to face whatever consequences that might bring. There was no turning back. With one last glance at the sword, Elias made a decision. He would take it with him. He had no idea why, or what it meant, but deep down, he knew it was his only choice. Something had been awakened, and he was tied to it in ways he couldn't yet explain. The sword was his destiny, whether he was ready for it or not. As he turned to leave the ruins, a shadow crossed his path. He paused, feeling a sudden unease settle over him. He wasn't alone, he realized. Someone, or something, was watching him. But when he looked around, all he saw was the emptiness of the ruins. The wind whispered through the broken walls, and the silence returned, but this time it felt heavier. It felt as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The sword had chosen him, and the universe had a plan for him, whether he liked it or not. The question was, would he survive whatever was coming next? The answer, he had no idea. But one thing was certain, his life would never be the same again. And so, with the sword in hand and 1,000 unanswered questions in his mind, Elias stepped into the unknown, his heart pounding with the weight of his newfound destiny. The lost emperor had been found, but what would he do with the power that had been thrust upon him? Only time would tell. The wind was cool, brushing against Elias' face as he stepped deeper into the ruins. The once great city lay in silence, its stone walls crumbling, covered in moss, vines creeping over what was once grand architecture. The past seemed to whisper in the breeze, a history long forgotten but still lingering in the air. Elias, a man who had no true place in the galaxy, found himself here by sheer coincidence. A wanderer, a traveler, searching for stories to tell, but never one to believe in the legends of lost empires or mythical weapons. He had come across the planet by accident, drifting off course in search of an ancient star map. What he found instead was this place, silent and desolate, filled with the remnants of a civilization long gone. But as he walked among the decaying structures, he couldn't help but feel the weight of history on his shoulders, a sense that there was more to this place than mere ruins. Elias wandered, his boots crunching over debris, his eyes scanning every crumbled pillar and broken statue. A strange unease tugged at him, the feeling that he wasn't the only one walking through the remains of this city. It was as if the very ground was alive with secrets, waiting for someone to discover them. And then, as if by fate, he found it. At the foot of a half-collapsed wall, partially buried beneath dust and debris, something gleamed. A glint of metal caught his attention. Elias crouched down, brushing away the dirt, his heart quickening. It wasn't much, just a piece of metal, perhaps a relic of the past. But as he dug deeper, more of it emerged from the earth. Slowly, carefully, he uncovered what appeared to be a sword. The blade was old, rusted with age, its once sharp edges now dulled and weathered by time. The hilt was decorated with intricate symbols that Elias didn't recognize. The sword seemed ordinary enough, just another forgotten piece of history, another artifact to collect and take back to the nearest auction house. But something about it caught his attention. There was a strange energy around it, almost as if it was alive, waiting for something or someone. Elias reached down and wrapped his fingers around the sword's hilt. The moment his hand made contact, a sudden shock of energy coursed through him. He gasped, his body stiffening as a rush of images flooded his mind. He saw flashes of a grand palace, soldiers marching in formation, a massive empire stretching across the stars. And then, just as quickly, everything turned to chaos. Betrayal, destruction, a world on fire. The visions came so fast, so vividly, that Elias had to stumble back, dropping the sword as he tried to steady himself. His breath was shallow, his hands shaking. For a moment, he couldn't understand what had just happened. Was it a vision? A hallucination? But no, it felt too real, too intense. He looked at the sword again, now lying motionless on the ground. There was no denying it. The sword had done something to him, something beyond his understanding. Elias bent down again, warily picking up the sword. The visions had stopped, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The world around him felt different. The weight of the sword in his hand seemed heavier than before, its power pulsing just beneath the surface. The whispers, barely audible, seemed to call to him, urging him to unlock the mysteries of the past. But what did it all mean? Why had the sword chosen him? He was just a man, nothing special, with no connections to any empire or ancient lineage. But deep inside, something told him that his life was about to change, that this sword, this relic, was part of a much bigger story, one that he couldn't possibly understand yet. As he stood there, holding the ancient weapon, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. He turned quickly, but there was no one in sight. The ruins were as empty as they had been moments before. Still, that nagging sense of being observed remained, like the shadows were alive, moving just beyond his reach. He hesitated. The sword felt warm now, as if it had come to life in his hands. Elias tried to make sense of the visions, but they were still too fragmented. The images of the empire, the ruler, the betrayal, it all seemed to be connected, but the details were beyond his grasp. It was then that the voice spoke. Soft, like a whisper carried on the wind, the voice emerged from within his mind. The lost emperor. It said, the one who was hidden. The sword will find its master. Elias froze. He hadn't heard it with his ears. No, it had come from deep within him, as if the sword itself was speaking directly into his mind. His pulse quickened. The lost emperor. Was that what the sword had meant? Was he the one? But how could that be possible? He was just Elias, a wanderer, a scavenger. There was no way he could be some long-lost ruler of a galaxy-spanning empire. And yet, the more he held the sword, the more the words seemed to resonate with him, like some long-buried truth was rising to the surface. The voice continued, its tone low and urgent. You have been chosen. You are the heir. The throne awaits. Elias shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. This was absurd. The sword was old, a relic, nothing more. He was not an emperor. He wasn't anything special. But then, why did it feel like the sword was pulling him in? Why did it feel like the universe itself had set this moment in motion? He took a deep breath and looked around the ruins once more. There was no sign of any other life, no sign of anyone else coming to claim the sword. For the first time in his life, Elias felt the weight of something greater than himself pressing down on him. He was meant for something. He just didn't know what yet. The sword's whispers faded into silence, but the tension in the air remained. Elias tightened his grip on the hilt and made his decision. He would leave the ruins. He would take the sword and try to understand what had happened here. He wasn't sure where he was going or what was awaiting him, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just walk away from this. As he turned to leave the crumbling city behind, Elias felt the eyes of the past on him, and the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. The lost emperor had been found. But the questions were just beginning. What had he truly uncovered? What awaited him beyond this moment? The journey was only beginning, and Elias had no idea just how much the galaxy was about to change because of him. But one thing was clear: the sword had chosen him, and whether he was ready for it or not, he was about to face a destiny he never could have imagined. Elias woke to the harsh light of dawn creeping through the cracks in the ruins. His eyes snapped open, still disoriented from the strange dreams that had haunted his sleep. The visions hadn't stopped. They had only grown more vivid, more insistent, every time he closed his eyes. He sat up slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the sword that lay beside him. It was the first thing his fingers touched, as if the weapon had drawn him to it, even in his unconscious state. The sword's cold surface sent a shiver through his arm as he grasped it. For a moment, it felt like the weight of the entire galaxy was in his hands. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore the overwhelming pull of it, but the voice that had whispered to him before returned, as if waiting just beneath his thoughts. "The Emperor rises," it said softly, "and with him, the Empire will return." Elias clenched his jaw, trying to push the voice aside. This couldn't be happening. He was no emperor. He was just a man, an outcast with no ties to any throne, no bloodline to claim. There was no way the galaxy's history had singled him out for something so impossible. The sword, however, seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't ignore, and the dreams, the strange visions of a vast empire on the brink of collapse, filled his mind once more. A planet consumed by fire, the throne room shrouded in shadows, the face of a ruler, a person whose features were as unfamiliar as they were haunting. He looked at the sword once more. The ornate symbols on the hilt seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, as if the weapon itself was alive, urging him to follow its call. Elias stood, shaking off the unsettling thoughts that clung to him like a dark cloud. The ruins were silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind and the distant echoes of a past long forgotten. But it wasn't just the sword that was making him feel this way. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the entire place, the crumbling city, the scattered ruins, had a sense of purpose to it. This wasn't just an ancient civilization lost to time. This was the cradle of something grand, and he had been chosen to find it, to uncover what had been buried for so long. With a sigh, Elias slung the sword across his back, the weight of it settling against his shoulder. The air was thick with tension, the kind of tension that fills the space just before something monumental happens. He had no idea where to begin, but the sword had drawn him here, and that had to mean something. The path ahead was unclear, but he had to follow it. There was no turning back. As he made his way out of the ruins, he glanced up at the sky, the stars dim in the early morning light. The galaxy stretched out before him, vast and endless. He had no idea where he was headed next, but the sword seemed to know. Its presence in his life was no coincidence. He could feel it in his bones. It was as if destiny had grabbed him by the shoulders and thrust him into something far greater than he had ever imagined. He walked for what felt like hours, the weight of the sword always on his back, always there, as if it were a constant reminder of his role in whatever this was. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Elias began to notice something strange. There were no other signs of life. No birds, no insects, not even the distant hum of civilization. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He had been so focused on the sword and the visions it brought that he hadn't realized how isolated he truly was. The emptiness around him was almost suffocating, but even more unsettling was the growing feeling that he was being watched. He paused, scanning the horizon, but saw nothing. No ships in the sky, no figures in the distance, yet the sensation remained. Then, just as he was about to continue, he heard it. A faint sound, like the rustling of leaves, but more deliberate. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of the sword, his heart racing. He wasn't alone. Elias stepped back into the shadows of a nearby building, peering around the corner. His eyes narrowed as he tried to make out any movement. For a moment, he saw nothing, but then, from the corner of his vision, a figure emerged, a tall, cloaked individual moving swiftly, almost effortlessly, across the open expanse. They didn't seem to notice Elias hiding in the shadows. The figure stopped just short of the ruin Elias had passed earlier. They were studying something, a device of some kind, ancient and glowing faintly. It was impossible to make out the details from where Elias stood, but it was clear that whatever it was, it had the figure's full attention. He considered moving closer, but the last thing he wanted was to be seen by someone who clearly knew more about this place than he did. The last few hours had been filled with nothing but confusion, and he wasn't eager to add danger to the mix. But something about the figure intrigued him. They had come for a reason, and that reason might just be connected to him. The sword, the visions, the empire, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle, and this stranger might hold the key. Elias hesitated for a moment longer, then made his decision. He couldn't just stay hidden. Not now. He needed answers. The voice in his head, the whispers from the sword, had promised him that his destiny awaited. If he wanted to understand why the sword had chosen him, he needed to approach the unknown. With that thought, he stepped out from the shadows, drawing the sword from his back. His grip tightened on the hilt, the strange power of it surging through him. The figure turned just as he moved closer, their eyes locking with his. Elias could see the surprise in their gaze, but before they could speak, Elias spoke first, his voice steady, but filled with an unshakable determination. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but I need answers." The figure didn't move, didn't speak for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, they lowered the device in their hand and tilted their head slightly, studying Elias as if they were seeing him for the first time. "Then come with me," the figure said, their voice low but commanding. "The truth is closer than you think." And with those words, Elias realized he was no longer just a wanderer in a forgotten city. He was a part of something far larger than himself. The questions would soon be answered, but first he would need to trust the stranger and the sword that had brought him here. Elias followed the cloaked figure through the desolate city, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the ruins around them. The figure moved with such purpose that Elias felt compelled to keep up, his every step seeming to sync with theirs. There was an air of quiet urgency about them, like they were on a mission that couldn't wait. As they navigated through the winding streets, Elias felt as though he was walking through a dream, the crumbled buildings and decaying structures blending into one vast blur. There were no signs of life, no animals, no people, nothing to break the silence, except for the occasional whisper of wind. The place had once been bustling with activity. He was sure of it, but now it was a graveyard, a long-forgotten chapter in the story of a civilization that had collapsed, or perhaps had been wiped out entirely. He caught a glimpse of the sky above, a deep blue void, a reminder of how small and insignificant his world had once seemed. But now, with the sword at his side and the mysterious figure guiding him, everything had changed. Elias wasn't just wandering aimlessly anymore. He had a sense of purpose, a sense that something greater was at play. Finally, the figure stopped in front of a large, weathered building. Its structure was taller than the rest, standing as a monument to the city's former grandeur. The stone walls were adorned with intricate carvings, almost as if the building itself had been built as a shrine to something or someone. There was a set of wide, stone steps leading up to an imposing double door that was slightly ajar. Without a word, the figure pushed open the door, the sound of it creaking in the still air. Elias hesitated for a moment but followed them inside, his heart pounding in his chest. What awaited him behind this door? The anticipation was unbearable. The interior of the building was even more impressive than the outside. The ceiling was high, supported by columns that reached up to the shadows above. The floor was made of polished stone, with faint patterns carved into it, though they had faded with time. Light filtered through cracks in the walls, casting long shadows across the room. At the far end, Elias could make out a throne, large and imposing, as though it had been waiting for someone to return and claim it. "This is where it all begins," the figure said, their voice reverberating through the chamber, as though the building itself was listening. Elias looked around, his eyes falling on the throne. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before, its design ancient, but still magnificent. It was made of a strange material, dark and smooth, almost like obsidian, but with an iridescent sheen that seemed to shimmer when caught in the light. Around it, the walls were decorated with strange symbols, ones Elias couldn't recognize. They looked like a mix of writing and intricate designs, almost as though they were telling a story, one that was lost to time. Elias's fingers tightened around the armrest of the throne as the visions flooded his mind. For a moment, he could barely breathe, overwhelmed by the weight of the galaxy's history. The images were like flashes of light, blurred yet vivid, overwhelming yet clear. He saw the empire at its peak, a civilization spanning countless worlds, all bound together under the rule of a single leader. That leader, his ancestor, sat on this very throne, gazing over an empire that was as powerful as it was fragile. He saw the faces of those who had betrayed the emperor, turning their backs on the empire in favor of power. The wars that had erupted from within, shaking the foundations of the once great civilization. And then the collapse, the empire's downfall, orchestrated by those who feared the emperor's power. The throne had been abandoned, hidden away in this ruin, waiting for someone worthy to claim it again. Waiting for him. A voice broke through the storm of images, pulling him back to reality. "It is time, Elias." The figure's words echoed in the chamber, steady and commanding. Elias blinked, still disoriented, as the visions slowly faded. The weight of the throne was no longer just a symbol of power. It was a responsibility, one he wasn't sure he was ready to bear. But the sword on his back, the one that had brought him here, thrummed against his spine. The same sword that had been calling to him from the very beginning. He stood there for a long moment, the decision gnawing at him. His mind raced with thoughts of the empire, of the throne, of the weight of history pressing down on him. Could he truly take on the mantle of a ruler? The stories and the visions, of battles won and lost, of a galaxy brought to its knees, seemed so distant, so impossible. How could a simple man like him step into such a role? But as the figure's gaze never wavered, Elias felt something stir within him. It wasn't just the sword. It wasn't just the throne. It was something deeper, a connection, perhaps, to a part of himself he had never known. His bloodline was tied to the throne, and the empire had been waiting for him to return. Elias stepped forward, his resolve hardening like stone. He had always been an outcast, wandering from place to place, never finding a place to belong. But this felt different. This was not a decision about what he wanted. It was about what the galaxy needed. It was about restoring what had been lost. He couldn't turn his back on it. Not now. He sank down onto the throne. As soon as his body made contact with the seat, the chamber seemed to shift. The walls seemed to hum with life, the symbols on the stone walls glowing brighter, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The sword on his back pulsed with an energy that was undeniable, its hum vibrating through the air. A strange warmth spread through his body, and the whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent. "The Emperor rises," the voice said again, its tone reverent, as though it were acknowledging something monumental. "And with him, the empire shall return." Elias closed his eyes, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within him. He had always known there was something more to his life than the endless wandering, the life of a nobody. He had always known there was a reason he had come to this place, a reason the sword had chosen him. He wasn't just Elias anymore. He wasn't just a man with no past and no future. He was the lost emperor, the one destined to reclaim what had been lost. The figure moved closer, kneeling before him. "It is done," they said, their voice filled with respect. "The Empire is yours to command. But you are not alone in this. There are those who still remember, those who know of your return." Elias glanced at the figure, who remained kneeling in front of him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and confusion. "What's your role in all of this?" The figure rose to their feet slowly, their cloak falling away to reveal a set of armor beneath. It was worn but finely crafted, a stark contrast to the ruined surroundings. The armor had a regal, ancient look to it, covered in symbols that seemed to mirror those on the throne. "I am one of the last of the old guard," the figure said, their voice steady. "I was born to protect the throne and its rightful heir. The fall of the Empire did not destroy our loyalty. We have waited in the shadows, watching for the day the Emperor would return." Elias's heart beat faster, his mind struggling to keep up with the revelations. He wasn't alone in this. There were others who had been waiting for him, for his return. He wasn't just some lost soul who had stumbled upon an ancient relic. He was part of something much bigger. He had a duty now, one that he couldn't escape. "What happens now?" Elias asked, standing from the throne, his body filled with a sudden surge of determination. The figure bowed their head respectfully. "Now, you reclaim your empire. You must gather those who remain loyal. There are factions scattered across the galaxy, some waiting for your call, others who will seek to challenge you. The galaxy will test you, Elias, but you must remain strong. You are the heir to the throne, and the legacy of the Empire is yours to carry." Elias looked at the throne once more. It was no longer just a seat of power. It was a symbol of everything he had lost and everything he was about to gain. The weight of the decision was heavy, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like his destiny, something he had been meant to do all along. "I'm ready," Elias said, his voice firm with conviction. "Let the Empire rise again." And with that, the future began to unfold before him. The Empire was waiting, its pieces scattered across the stars. The challenges ahead would be great, but Elias knew one thing with certainty: he would stop at nothing to reclaim what had been lost. The galaxy would soon know that the Emperor had returned. Elias stood tall before the throne, a feeling of clarity washing over him as the weight of his decision settled deep in his chest. The power of the throne was no longer just an abstract concept. It was a reality that he had to come to terms with. His ancestors' blood pulsed through his veins, and the sword on his back hummed in response to the ancient energy surrounding him. But the future wasn't just about reclaiming power. It was about taking responsibility for what had been broken. "We must act quickly," the figure spoke again, their voice breaking the silence, filled with urgency. "The Empire's enemies will not wait. There are factions scattered throughout the galaxy who seek to maintain their control, who will stop at nothing to ensure you do not sit upon this throne. You may have the bloodline of emperors, but you will need more than that to survive." Elias nodded, his eyes narrowing. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. Rebuilding an empire wouldn't be easy, and the power structures of the galaxy were not kind to those who challenged the status quo. He had seen the devastation in the visions, the betrayals, the wars, and now he understood that the galaxy would not welcome him with open arms. To take back what was once his would take more than just strength. It would take allies, trust, and most importantly, time. "What should we do first?" Elias asked, trying to steady his thoughts. The uncertainty still lingered, but beneath it was a fire that had begun to grow inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of countless worlds, countless lives. The figure looked at him, eyes sharp. "First, we must gather those who still remember the old ways. There are hidden forces, people who held loyalty to the Empire even as it fell. They are scattered, hiding in the shadows, waiting for a signal. You must reach out to them. We cannot rebuild alone." Elias's mind raced as he thought about the vastness of the task ahead. It wasn't as if he could just send out a message and expect an army to materialize. The Empire had been in ruins for centuries, and the rebellion against it had torn apart every corner of the galaxy. Trust would be in short supply. Allies would be hard to come by. How do we find them? Elias asked. The figure stepped closer, their eyes glinting with a secret knowledge. There are ancient beacons hidden across the galaxy, left behind by those loyal to the old empire. They were placed in strategic locations, known only to the select few who remained faithful. These beacons will guide you to them. They are your first step toward reclaiming your power. Elias felt a surge of determination. It was a starting point, a sliver of hope in the overwhelming uncertainty. But even with these beacons, Elias knew that the journey ahead would not be simple. The galaxy was a vast and dangerous place, full of factions that wouldn't hesitate to destroy him if he showed any sign of weakness. He turned to face the figure fully. What happens if I fail? The figure didn't hesitate. Failure is not an option, Elias. The galaxy is on the brink of war, and your return may be the only thing that can prevent it. But there will be no second chances. You must lead with conviction, or the consequences will be catastrophic. A chill ran down Elias's spine. He wasn't just reclaiming a throne. He was standing at the crossroads of the galaxy's future. The responsibility was far greater than he had ever imagined. Every decision, every action, would shape the fate of millions of people across the stars. But despite the pressure, Elias felt something inside him begin to solidify, a sense of purpose he had never known before. He wasn't alone. The sword on his back, the beacons that called to him, the figure who stood beside him, all of it was a sign that he was meant for this. The Empire had not fallen completely. There were still those who believed in its potential, still those who were willing to fight for it. And Elias would be their leader. I understand, Elias said, his voice steady, no longer filled with doubt. I will not fail. The figure nodded, a silent approval in their eyes. Then we begin. Without another word, they turned and walked towards the far wall of the chamber, their hand brushing over a hidden panel. The stone shifted, revealing a passageway that led deeper into the building. Elias followed, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. As they walked, the figure explained the next steps, how to locate the first beacon and the coordinates they would need to reach the hidden location. But even as Elias listened, his thoughts kept returning to the same question. How could he possibly unite the fractured remnants of the Empire when its enemies were still out there, waiting to strike? He knew the road ahead would be full of danger, but it was also full of promise. The promise of a future in which the galaxy could once again thrive, united under a single banner. As they reached the end of the passageway, the figure turned to him one last time. Remember, Elias, you are not just fighting for power. You are fighting for the future of all worlds, all people. Your actions will echo across the stars. With that, they handed him a small, intricate device, something ancient yet functional. The beacon's key. Elias took it into his hand, feeling the weight of its significance. This was the first step, the beginning of something far greater than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just a relic, it was a beacon of hope. We move at dawn, the figure said, and Elias nodded in agreement. The journey had begun, and nothing, not the galaxy's vastness, nor the enemies that would come against him, would stop him from reclaiming what was his. The Empire was waiting for its emperor, and Elias was ready to answer the call.